All right. Last week I introduced the new atheism and made the point that what's new about it is not its arguments or its intellectual sophistication, but its open hostility to God. That's really the only thing that's new. And at the end of the class, I explained that one of the major themes of the new atheists is that Christianity, like all religions, promotes beliefs that are irrational in the sense that there's no evidence to support them. This is a big thing for them. That's what bothers them, supposedly, is that we promote beliefs that are irrational, that there's no evidence to support them. Christianity is accused of getting people to believe fantasies. Fantasies. Things they have absolutely no reason to believe are true. We're analogized to Sam Harris believing that Nicole Kidman is in love with him, even though they've never met. You see, it's just utter delusion. And that's one of their big things. Now, this morning I'll begin explaining why that's nonsense by showing that there are good, rational reasons for believing in the existence of God and believing in other aspects of the Christian faith. And the first claim that I want to make is that it is more reasonable, it's more reasonable to believe that a timeless, non-material, spaceless, and immensely powerful personal being caused the universe to come into existence. It is more reasonable to believe that than to believe the universe came into existence uncaused from nothing. Now, the first step in establishing that claim is what's known as the Kalam cosmological argument. This is an argument that's been around for many centuries, and it's been popularized in the last 20 years or so by a philosopher and theologian named William Lane Craig. And I wanted first just to give you the argument. And the argument is, everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. It is brought into existence by something. Second, the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause for its existence. It was brought into existence by something. Now, you can see this is a logically valid argument. By that I mean that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true by force of logic. It's like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So the argument is logically valid, meaning that if the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows by the force of logic. So I want to go through the premises and convince you that they are true, or at the very least, more likely true. So the first one is everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. As expressed in the ancient Latin adage, ex nihilo nihil fit, from nothing, nothing comes. That should be obvious. I mean, if you start with nothing, you'll never get anything. And the reason you'll never get anything is that something can only come into existence if something causes it to do so. Nothing, being the absence of anything, it has no properties. And thus it has no causal capacity. It has no potential to bring anything into existence. As put by the noted 17th century British philosopher John Locke, man knows by intuitive certainty that bare nothing can no more produce any real being than it can be equal to two right angles. You just understand that if there is nothing, it can't create and cause something to come into existence. If things can just pop into existence from nothing, there's no reason that wouldn't happen all the time. If that's possible, there's no reason it wouldn't be happening all the time. If things don't need a cause for coming into existence, what's to stop anything and everything from popping into existence? But the uniform experience of humanity is that this doesn't happen. None of us fear that a tiger will appear out of nothing in the seat next to us. None of us fear that, because we know that nothing can produce nothing. Now, the claim, when you say this, most people accept this. Most people understand that. But there are some people who want to resist this first premise, and typically what you'll run into is that they will bring up virtual particles from quantum mechanics. They'll bring this up and they'll say, look, they will claim that, look, on the subatomic level, you see, they'll argue, no, I have a counterexample to that. I have a counterexample that shows that there is, in fact, a case where something comes into existence uncaused. It comes into existence uncaused by anything. And they speak of virtual particles, and they say, look, that on the subatomic level, quantum physics shows that so-called virtual particles, that they blink into existence spontaneously in a way that's not determined or necessitated by a prior state. Well, I'm here to say to you that that is not a counterexample. That is not an example of something coming into existence out of nothing without something causing it to do so. And I say that's not a valid counterexample, first because virtual particles may not really exist. In the first place, you see, it's far from certain that virtual particles really exist. They are undetectable and are argued by many people to be only theoretical constructs, instruments to give an intuition to mathematical rules. Robert Weingard made that claim in 1982 in an article, Do Virtual Particles Exist? 2002, the philosopher of science Tobias Fox, haunted by the specter of virtual particles. And the renowned physicist and philosopher of science, Mario Bunge, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, himself an atheist. He wrote in his 2012 book, Evaluating Philosophies, what is the status of the virtual particles occurring in theoretical particle physics? Are they real or fictitious? This is the reply of the Stanford Linear Accelerator people. Quote, virtual particles are a language invented by physicists in order to talk about processes in terms of the Feynman diagrams. These diagrams are a shorthand for a calculation that gives the probability of a process, end quote. And then Bunge says, shorter, virtual particles are only computational devices. He continues to repeat, the virtual particles are fictitious and therefore unobservable. They are but artifacts invented to use Feynman diagrams. So the first thing that you have is there's a real question, do virtual particles even exist? Or are they simply a computational mechanism? But second, even if they do exist, there are deterministic interpretations. I'm neither a physicist nor the son of a physicist, but I can read. You see, and so there are deterministic interpretations of quantum physics, such as that of the physicist David Bohm, under which the appearance of these virtual particles is not random or spontaneous, but it only seems that way, being in fact determined or necessitated by prior conditions. Here's what William Lane Craig says about it. This is a philosopher and theologian who spends a lot of time in this world. He says, in the first place, wholly apart from the disputed question of whether virtual particles really exist at all, not all physicists agree that subatomic events are uncaused. A great many physicists today are quite dissatisfied with the traditional Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics and are exploring deterministic theories like that of David Bohm. Indeed, most of the available interpretations of the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics are fully deterministic. So you have to see, even if they really do exist, there are deterministic interpretations that would not have these things appearing spontaneously or randomly, but only seeming to do so. That's the second point. Thirdly, even if they do really exist, and even if their appearance is random or spontaneous, the particles don't come into being out of nothing. They don't come into being out of nothing, you see. Their existence, their appearance is conditioned on the prior existence of an energy-laden, subatomic, quote, vacuum, what is called the quantum field. As Craig says, they arise as spontaneous fluctuations of the energy contained in the subatomic vacuum, which constitutes an indeterministic cause of their origination. Now, Emanuel Rutten, he earned a PhD. His 2012 doctoral thesis from a university in Amsterdam, Rutten says, besides, one could argue that even in the case of the Copenhagen interpretation, and the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics is the one under which their appearance is considered random or spontaneous, as opposed to one of the deterministic theories of someone like David Bohm. Okay, so he says, besides, one could argue that even in the case of the Copenhagen interpretation, virtual particles do not pop into existence wholly uncaused, for they originate from the quantum vacuum, which is an object itself. So that on a non-Aristotelian view of causation, one could adequately hold that these particles, although not having an efficient cause, causa efficiens, have a proper material cause, causa materialis, and are therefore not uncaused. In other words, they are dependent on the prior existence of this material. And so in that sense, they don't come into existence uncaused out of nothing. Okay, so I want you to see where I am in this is everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. All of this stuff about virtual particles was simply to alert you to, you will run into this, and sometimes people who don't know any better go, oh, well, I didn't know that. Virtual particles, okay, there you go. I guess everything does pop into existence out of nothing. So I want you to alert you to that. That's why I don't believe that. Okay, so first here, everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Virtual particles are not a counterexample. Now, without regard to the testimony of Scripture, I believe the testimony of Scripture, and I believe there are reasons for believing the testimony of Scripture, but I'm going to set aside the testimony of Scripture, which very clearly says that the universe had a beginning. But I'm going to set that aside without regard to the testimony of Scripture. There are good philosophical and scientific reasons for thinking the universe began to exist. The philosophical argument for the universe having a beginning involves the strangeness of infinity and the nature of an actual infinite. The idea, now I'm going to try to phrase this in a number of different ways, because it's not the easiest concept to grab, but if you grab it, you go, oh, I think. So let me come at this in a couple of different ways, all right? And the idea is that past time cannot be infinite, because an infinite amount of time cannot already have been exhausted so as to arrive at the present. The inexhaustible cannot have been exhausted. One could never traverse an infinite sequence of time units, seconds, minutes, hours. You could never traverse an infinite sequence of time units or events to arrive at now. Past history cannot have counted down from minus infinity to the present. It couldn't have done that. You could never say that an infinite amount of time has already passed. An infinite amount of time can never pass because it is limitless. So it can't have already passed to get now. So when you look back and say, well, how much time has passed? Already an infinite amount of time has passed to come down. Well, how can that be? You see, it's limitless. See, it can only be in process. It can never be complete. It can never be actual. And this is known as the impossibility of an actual infinite. The German mathematician, David Hilbert, he said, very famous German mathematician, he said, the infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea. And so it works and has functionality in mathematics and these kinds of things. But an actual infinite, having exhausted an infinite amount of time to arrive at the present, cannot occur. Now, a potential infinite, an infinite future time, an infinity, that's an infinity that is in progress. So it poses no problem. Like the idea of an actual infinite, like the claim of having already traversed an infinite amount of time. And this would not mean, by the way, when you talk like this, right away people get nervous. They say, well, then what about God? You see, this would not mean that God has not always existed, that God is not permanent, because there are ways of dealing with God's relationship to time so that he doesn't exist in a sequence of individuated moments. You see, he transcends time. He is in some sense timeless. He is beyond or outside of time. So there are ways of understanding God's relationship to time so that this doesn't preclude his permanence. Time is a creation. And that's not just me thinking that. That's many people think that. You see, so when you talk this way, that would not preclude the idea of God being permanent. Now, this makes sense to me, and it makes sense, by the way, to many philosophers, but I have to say there are philosophers who are not persuaded by this. Okay? There are philosophers who are not persuaded by this. This philosophical reason for thinking that the universe necessarily began to exist seems strong to me, persuades many philosophers, but there are those who aren't persuaded. But what is interesting is that it dovetails very nicely with the scientific acceptance of the universe having a beginning, subject to which I now turn. Now, the scientific arguments for the universe having a beginning, they often involve the second law of thermodynamics. Okay, I hope this rings a bell somewhere in your schooling. I remember hearing something about that. But the second law of thermodynamics, which establishes without exception that processes taking place in a closed physical system, which for the atheist the universe is, processes taking place in a closed physical system, they always tend toward a state of equilibrium. In other words, every such system will eventually run down. It will eventually run down and cease having energy available for work. That's why you can't have a perpetual motion machine. Everybody recognizes that in principle, you cannot have a perpetual motion machine because everything will eventually run down. You see, it will run down. Here's how the theoretical physicist Paul Davies expressed this in 1995. He said, there are many physical processes occurring in the universe that proceed at a finite rate and are irreversible. For example, the formation and death of stars and the emission of starlight into space. You can't run these processes backwards. But if the universe is infinitely old, then these irreversible processes would have all run their course by now, and the entire universe would have reached its final state. But that hasn't happened yet. So the universe can't have existed forever. We know there must have been an absolute beginning of finite time ago. Now, the attempts to get around this conclusion, you can imagine people don't like this conclusion. But the attempts to get around this conclusion of an absolute beginning, they have not been persuasive. Now remember, I've got people telling me that I'm a complete airhead for believing God exists. You have absolutely no reason to think that. You're delusional for thinking that. Well, we're going to see where the delusional shoe fits. Okay, so here we have, there are attempts to get around these, but these attempts have not been persuasive. January 8th of 2012, there was a meeting of world-class cosmologists at Cambridge University in honor of physicist Stephen Hawking's 70th birthday. That gathering was called the State of the Universe. And the report of the event in New Scientist magazine by Lisa Grossman, it was reported 3 days later, that report was titled, "Why Physicists Can't Avoid a Creation Event." And here's what Ms. Grossman said. While many of us may be okay with the idea of the Big Bang simply starting everything, physicists, including Hawking, tend to shy away from cosmic genesis. Quote, "A point of creation would be a place where science broke down. One would have to appeal to religion and the hand of God," end quote. Hawking told the meeting at the University of Cambridge in a pre-recorded speech. For a while, it looked like it might be possible to dodge this problem by relying on models such as an eternally inflating or cyclic universe, both of which seem to continue infinitely in the past as well as the future. However, as cosmologist Alexander Vilenkin of Tufts University in Boston explained last week, that hope has been gradually fading and may now be dead. He showed that all these theories still demand a beginning. Now, the editorial that accompanied that article, the editorial in New Scientist, that was titled "The Genesis Problem." And that editorial in the New Scientist included this: "The Big Bang is now part of the furniture of modern cosmology, but Hoyle's unease," that's Sir Frederick Hoyle, "unease has not gone away." He didn't like the idea because he wanted a permanent universe. "Many physicists have been fighting a rearguard action against it because most of them accept it." But you've had some people over here trying to get around it. "Many physicists have been fighting a rearguard action against it for decades, largely because of its theological overtones. If you have an instant of creation, don't you need a creator? Cosmologists thought they had a workaround. Over the years, they've tried on several different models for the universe that dodge the need for a beginning while still requiring a Big Bang. But recent research has shot them full of holes. It now seems certain that the universe did have a beginning." Now, this is the science people. They're not considering the philosophical argument. They're looking at this is a science thing. Now, the September 2013 issue of Discover magazine, it had an article about Alexander Vilenkin. Now, by the way, Vilenkin is a theoretical physicist, cosmologist, and professor of physics and director of the Institute of Cosmology at Tufts University. I mean, he's a bigwig when you're talking about cosmologists. But they had an article about him titled "What Came Before the Big Bang." This is in September of 2013. And it's included this: "Indeed," says Vilenkin, "among all the ideas we've thought of so far for a universe without a beginning, none of them seem to work." So the answer to the question of whether the universe had a beginning is yes, it probably did. You see, and he has probably is designed simply to leave room for some new idea or argument. He's not going to say that it's metaphysically impossible for somebody to construct an argument or something, but he's saying everything that I see now, yes, it had a beginning. Now, it remains possible. It remains possible to construct completely speculative mathematical models of an eternal universe. But those models, they all depend on unverifiable assumptions, which they all do. So, in other words, I'm going to assume something about splitter space. Well, can we know whether that? No, you can't know that, but I'm going to assume that. Okay? So they all include these unverifiable assumptions. They all wind up, by the way, with mysteries of their own, and they all have what Vilenkin and others say amount to a kind of beginning anyway. They amount to a kind of beginning, and they are contrary to what the current evidence suggests. For example, the atheist cosmologist Lawrence Krauss, who's one of the new atheists, he said the following. He had this exchange with William Lane Craig in August of 2013. Krauss, I would agree that all the evidence shows, let's accept that fact. Craig says, all right. All the evidence suggests our universe had a beginning. Craig, kind of surprised. Oh, okay. He says, but we don't know. That's what I keep telling you. Knowing and suspecting are two vastly different things. So he acknowledges, you see, that it is in keeping with the very best evidence to conclude that the universe had a beginning. He just maintains that it's not metaphysically certain. It's not absolutely certain that there's some theoretical wiggle room. Now, of course, he's ignoring the philosophical argument that there necessarily is a beginning. He's ignoring that aspect of it, the philosophical argument about the impossibility of an actual infinite. But even with that, you see, here's the argument, the Kalam cosmological argument. If the premises of a logically valid argument are more likely true than not, then the conclusion of that argument is more likely true than not. In which case, it's certainly not irrational. It's certainly not irrational to accept the argument's conclusion. On the contrary, that is the reasonable and rational thing to do. Who's sitting in the reasonable seat? See, who's sitting in the reasonable seat? Says, well, I got to say, all the evidence looks that way, right? But, it might be possible somehow, some way, someday. Okay, but who's being reasonable about it? Certainly you can't accuse somebody who draws that conclusion of being irrational, you see? And as you'll see in a minute, if it's reasonable to think that the universe had a cause, it's reasonable to think that cause has a number of attributes associated with God. After a lengthy discussion of these issues, cosmological stuff, these issues and claims, here's how Robert J. Spitzer, who's a philosopher who's done a lot of work in this area, here's how he summarized the current state of scientific evidence on whether the universe had a beginning. This is from his 2010 book, New Proofs for the Existence of God, Contributions of Contemporary Physics and Philosophy. Spitzer says, the discussions in the foregoing sections, where he's been going through all of these different claims and arguments and this kind of thing, the discussions in the foregoing sections show that the preponderance of the cosmological evidence favors a beginning of the universe, prior to which there was no physical reality whatsoever. The beginning of physical reality marks the point at which our universe came into existence. There are currently no truly satisfactory alternatives to this beginning of physical reality. In view of the extensive applicability and preponderance of evidence for a beginning of the universe and the narrow and tenuous path which must be taken to get around it, he says it can be concluded that the evidence currently supports a reasonable likelihood of a beginning, a point at which the universe came into existence. Now, let me say, I do not believe the standard Big Bang model or any of the proposed eternal cosmological models. I do not believe they are true, because I believe they contradict Scripture. They are inconsistent with Scripture. But the point is that there's broad agreement, even in the secular scientific world, that the universe had a beginning. And that belief doesn't depend on any religious convictions. It doesn't depend on believing that the Bible is true. That's the point. Here's what theoretical physicist Paul Davies said in 2002. Today, few cosmologists doubt that the universe, at least as we know it, did have an origin at a finite moment in the past. John Lennox, who's a professor of mathematics at Oxford University, said, there is therefore a remarkable consensus of opinion nowadays that the universe had a beginning. Alistair McGrath, who's a professor of science and religion at Oxford University, wrote in 2009, it is now widely agreed that the universe had a beginning. So even if one rejects the philosophical argument that the universe necessarily had a beginning based on the impossibility of an actual infinite, there's still a broad scientific consensus that the universe did in fact have a beginning, and given the strong, rational, and reasonable conclusion that the universe had a beginning, there necessarily is a cause for its existence. Everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence, virtual particles notwithstanding. See, not a counterexample or the claim about virtual particles. Everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist. Well, therefore, the universe had a cause for its existence. Now, beyond that, the universe had a cause for its existence, but you can then understand that that cause is necessarily outside the universe. It's necessarily outside the universe. It couldn't be part of the universe because it caused the universe. It is independent of the universe. And a cause that is outside the universe and independent of the universe, we can infer certain things about that cause. We can infer a number of things about that cause. A cause that is outside of the universe and that which brings the universe into existence is a cause that is non-physical, that is immaterial, non-material, and spaceless, powerful, and in some sense timeless. It's non-physical because matter, energy, and space are part of the created universe and thus didn't exist prior to its existence. So here we have something outside the universe, and the universe is matter, energy, and space. So this thing that's independent of the universe is not matter, energy, and space. So we can infer that from the fact it's outside of and independent of the universe. It's powerful because it created the entire universe out of nothing. So it's powerful and it's beyond or outside of time because time, as we know and experience it, is itself a property of the created universe. That's why the universe is called the space-time universe. So it's interesting. We now have a cause of the universe, of the space-time universe, and this cause is outside of or independent of the universe, and therefore it is non-physical, immaterial, spaceless, immensely powerful. You see, it is immensely powerful, and it is timeless. Well, that's interesting. Moreover, it's personal. You say, well, how do you get to that? How do you get to this idea? You got to hang with me on this. This non-physical, timeless, amazingly powerful cause of the universe is most reasonably understood to be personal rather than some kind of impersonal force or impersonal set of conditions. You see, if the cause of the origin of the universe, if that cause were an impersonal force or an impersonal set of conditions, it would be impossible for that cause, that force, or that set of conditions to exist without its effect, the universe, also existing. They would necessarily be coexistent because when that cause or force or conditions existed, their effect would come into existence. You see, they would come into existence. And since the cause of the universe is timeless, because this is the space-time universe, it is outside of the universe, it is timeless, is permanent, then the universe, you see, would also be permanent. Right? Because if we have this cause of the universe, if it's an impersonal set of conditions or a force, and therefore when it existed, its effect would exist, if it is permanent, then the universe would necessarily be permanent. The universe could not have come into existence a finite time ago. Let me read to you an example from William Lane Craig, how he says this. This helped me. Maybe this will help you. He says, if the cause is sufficient to produce its effect, then if the cause is there, the effect must be there too. For example, water freezes when the temperature is below 0 degrees centigrade. The cause of the freezing is the temperature's falling to 0 degrees. If the temperature has always been below 0 degrees, then any water around would be frozen from eternity. It would be impossible for the water to begin to freeze just a finite time ago. Now the cause of the universe is permanently there since it is timeless, so why isn't the universe permanently there as well? Why did the universe come into existence only 13.7 billion years ago? That's the standard Big Bang dating. You see, why isn't it as permanent as its cause? You see, but if the universe, if the cause is a personal being rather than a mindless state or force or set of conditions, if it's a personal being, that being could choose. He could choose not to create the universe until a finite time ago. You see, in other words, if it's being created by a person, a personal being, he doesn't blindly just create. It's not, you see, if it's an impersonal force or effect, then if it exists, its cause exists. But that's not how it is with a personal being. The personal being could choose to create when he wants, and he could choose to create a finite time ago. And all of this, you see, fits squarely with traditional concepts of God as the eternal, non-physical, powerful, personal being. And so I return to this. It is more reasonable to believe, reasonable, not delusional, not insane, not irrational, not throwing darts at a board, and I think I'll believe that's true. It is more reasonable to believe that a timeless, immaterial, spaceless, and immensely powerful personal being caused the universe to come into existence than to believe it came into existence uncaused from nothing. Now, Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, he doesn't dispute either of the premises of the Kalam cosmological argument, that everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence and that the universe began to exist. Rather, he says, look, even if we allow for the existence of a first cause, the cause of the universe, even if we allow for the existence of a first cause that requires no explanation for its existence, which he labels a dubious luxury. He doesn't say why he labels it that way, and he's wrong to label it that way. But he says, even if we allow for that, he says, there's absolutely no reason to endow that first cause with any of the properties normally ascribed to God. Omnipotence, omniscience, goodness, creativity of design, to say nothing of such human attributes as listening to prayers, forgiving sins, and reading innermost thoughts. Now, as William Lane Craig, whom Dawkins refuses to debate, by the way. Craig was over in England begging Dawkins to debate him. In fact, Craig put an empty chair on the stand to represent Dawkins' refusal to debate him. But anyway, William Lane Craig talks about, he says, what an amazingly concessionary statement that is. Dawkins concedes a great deal there. You see, Dawkins doesn't dispute that the Kalam cosmological argument proves or makes likely the existence of an uncaused, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and unimaginably powerful personal creator of the universe. He simply says, look, it doesn't prove that this creator of the universe has all of the attributes of God. See, it doesn't prove that. You see, that he has all the attributes of God. Doesn't prove that or make that more likely. But that's not what the argument's designed to do. You see, the argument doesn't claim to be able to demonstrate all the aspects of God's being, but in proving or in making it more likely that there is an uncaused, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and powerful personal creator, you've reduced the atheist to saying, okay, there is such a being who brought the universe into, but it's not God. Well, do you see that that's a really bizarre form of atheism, isn't it? Right? That's what they want to hide there. And for all we know, this being that we've just demonstrated or made more likely may well have all those other characteristics. There's no indication he doesn't. Right? So this is where they wind up going. Now, I have to tell you, this is important. It's only that which begins to exist that must have a cause for coming into existence. See, that which has no beginning, that which has always existed, like the God envisioned by the great religions, you see, requires no cause for being. By the way, God's eternality, that doesn't conflict with the second law of thermodynamics, because that law applies to the behavior of matter and energy within the universe, not to a non-physical being that transcends the universe. So just hold that over there, okay, if that's bothering you. But you see here that this idea is only that which begins to exist that requires a cause for its existence. So the assertion, when I say, listen, God has no cause for his existence, he's self-existent. He always has been. He's self-existent. My saying that doesn't justify the assertion of somebody, well, then the universe always existed. You don't have to explain where God came from. I'm not going to explain where the universe came from. But see, they're different. You see, they're different in a very crucial way. The universe must have a cause for its existence because it had a beginning. It is only that which has a beginning, which begins to exist, that requires a cause, something that brings it into existence. To ask what caused God is to commit the category fallacy, in that one is incorrectly assigning God to the category of things that requires a cause. It is to ask, what caused the uncaused? It's nonsensical. It's like saying, what does time taste like? How tall is Tuesday? It doesn't apply. Okay, so Dawkins's reluctance to concede that God would not require a cause for his existence. Remember when he says, even if we say that there's this first cause that doesn't require a cause for its existence, a dubious luxury. It's not a dubious luxury at all. That is the God of the great religions. None of us believes in a created God. We all believe in the God who's self-existent. So he calls it a dubious luxury. But he's wrong in that. Let me end with what atheist philosopher Michael Ruse wrote in The Guardian in November of 2009. He said, I've written that the God delusion, Dawkins's book, made me ashamed to be an atheist, and I meant it. Trying to understand how God could need no cause, Christians claim that God exists necessarily. I have taken the effort to try to understand what that means. Dawkins and company are ignorant of such claims and positively contemptuous of those who even try to understand them, let alone believe them. Thus, like a first-year undergraduate, he can happily go around asking loudly, what caused God? What caused God? As though he'd made some momentous philosophical discovery. You see, that's not deep. That's just silly. But you get it all the time. Well, who made God? Who made God? You don't have an answer for that? I'm not. But they're different. Make me shoot myself. You see? They're different. So I heard that bell. Thanks.